Welcome to the CBIA BizCast powered by Google. I'm Amanda Marlow. On this episode, we're sitting down with CBIA Foundation Director Dustin Nord to talk about a new report on natural gas and Connecticut's electricity prices. But before that conversation, we want to begin this episode with some of the top stories you may have missed. CBIA is continuing to sound the alarm on the long-term structural weaknesses in Connecticut's job market. The Connecticut Department of Labor released its May jobs report this week. The state's labor force, those working and actively looking for work, fell by nearly 12,000 people in May. And in the last 12 months, nearly 38,000 have left the labor force. CBIA President and CEO Chris DiPentima said a shrinking labor force isn't a jobs issue. It's an economic growth and competitiveness issue. Governor Ned Lamont announced a new proposal to tax employers $1,000 for every employee enrolled in Medicaid. The proposal is an effort to offset the loss of federal health care tax credits. It targets for-profit businesses with 100 or more employees and nonprofits with 1,000 or more employees. Lamont said it could generate an estimated $100 million in annual revenue, but DiPentima warns the plan unfairly singles out Connecticut employers and risks undermining private sector confidence and the state's economic competitiveness. A broad set of new laws impacting the business community take effect July 1st. The changes cover a wide range of industries and issues, impacting everything from advertising practices to consumer protections, warehouse operations, product labeling, and repair rights. The measures are part of a larger package of more than 80 laws approved during the recent legislative session and signed by Governor Lamont. You can find a full breakdown of these changes and more headlines at CBIA.com. Let's turn now to one of the most important issues for businesses and residents across Connecticut. We're talking about the rising cost of energy. And who better to talk about it than the director of CBIA's Foundation, Dustin Nord. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Dustin, you wore your green pants. You're ready to get going on this conversation. Yeah. So kind of tell us a little bit, what do you think from your perspective? What are kind of the biggest drivers to Connecticut's energy costs?
Yeah, I think over the last decade plus, I think there's two areas. I think one of them is the supply of energy, specifically the lack of available fuel. So specifically things around natural gas, which means that it gets really expensive in the winter and often in the summer as well when we run out of that supply, and the inability to kind of grow that, the pipelines that we have that feed the natural gas system in the state. And the other piece is, investments in the distribution network and transmission network. As Connecticut's an older state, we have one of the older grids in the country, and over the last 20 years, we've had to invest a lot in that grid, and that's cost a lot of money as well.
So there was a recent report that came out of UConn that's kind of stirring up a lot of conversation, really kind of looking at the investments that we've made in natural gas, and the report argues that we made some wrong decisions. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about that report.
So the report came from CCEA, which is an economic advising group out of UConn. It was actually started back in the 90s during Lowell Weiker's term. And they do a lot of work around economic analysis in the state. And in this particular case, they did a report for the League of Conservation Voters and looking at natural gas system in the state and how that's impacted our energy markets. And their argument is that ultimately, this was a mistake, that we invested too much, and that the reliance that we have on natural gas is bad for consumers. And I think that the arguments they make around air quality and some other things are somewhat specious. Honestly, I don't think that they're super well supported, and I think it kind of misses some of the challenges that we see, and I think misdirects away from some areas that we genuinely need to be focused on if we're actually going to bring down the cost of energy in the state. And so that was what my response to it was really geared around.
What was the most supporting data that they had?
What they looked at was, I think they look at emissions, and they suggest, Connecticut has bad air quality in the state and how we've had to expand the number of gas plants, I should say, over the last decade plus. Again, I think when you look at the data, it doesn't really support that. We've reduced carbon emissions since our peak. We've reduced from the power generation sector. We have fewer, harmful gases that are emitted from the power sector. And we have overall better air quality now than we used to. So I think that was one of the main ones. And the other piece was price. And then what their suggestion was that the investments in distribution and transmission of those gas resources ultimately has been what's driving people's bills. But when we look into the data, we also don't find a lot of support that that's what's the cause of those higher costs. That is primarily a result of our high cost or our old grid that has had reliability issues outside of any sort of generation that we've had to invest heavily in over the last decade that, anybody can attest to that's lived through the storms that we've had over the last 15 plus years.
Yeah. And so Connecticut did make significant investments in natural gas, back during the Malloy administration. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think when you look at what has happened to energy prices, I think what's a bit of a narrative violation for most people is that if we actually look at inflation adjusted electricity price in the state, it's actually gone down over the last, 20 years or so. I think most people wouldn't really feel that that's the case. But when we look at prices and incomes or compare it to any sort of other price deflator, it's gotten cheaper. That's been different over the last few years.
That's a hot take.
That is a hot take. Now, it depends on the time frame that you're looking at, because over a long period of time, the investment in natural gas has actually driven down energy costs a lot. Over the last 5 years or so, post-COVID, we have seen an uptick in energy costs. But to say that that's primarily, we've seen an uptick in energy costs across different types of sources around the country and around the world, whether that's gas or coal or oil or anything, right? So this is saying that it's putting it all at the feet of natural gas, and I think that that's an oversimplification of what we've seen. So
you put out kind of a contrary to this article. Tell us a little bit more about your arguments.
Yeah, again, I think that I think it's reasonable to, and as I say in the piece, I think it's reasonable to evaluate our strategy as it relates to where we're going to get our electricity in the state. I think that's a completely reasonable take to have. I just think that from the perspective of, kind of intellectual integrity, it should be from a place of trying to ensure we have well-supported data so that we're making the right decisions more than anything. And I think the biggest thing that I learned from kind of checking in on some of the claims of the paper was, again, electricity cost is down. It hasn't really gone up. Carbon emissions are down, especially when we equate it to sort of the consumption habits of people in Connecticut. The power sector now only makes up 10% or so of our carbon emissions, significantly less than things like residential heat or transportation. And this paper, again, it just put a lot of emphasis on this one sector, on this one part of this one sector. And I think that blinds us to what is a much more complex issue. And I think potentially leads us astray as we're looking at the next 20 years. How do we make cheaper energy and achieve our carbon emissions goals, which are two, very, very important challenges for us going forward.
You mentioned at the beginning kind of constraints on the system. What does that high, spikes in demand actually mean for businesses?
Yeah, that means that your bills are higher as a result. It means that you're having to go out and try to negotiate better contracts or change the times of day that you're going to be using your energy, or find ways that you could potentially cut costs on that front. And I think that's a challenge. It means that you're not investing in other places like your people, like your equipment. It means you're investing in, trying to have on-site solar generation or something like that, in part because we don't have always the best systems in the state for getting you access to cheaper electricity as a business. But it's I think it is a challenge for a lot of companies, but I think this doesn't really address a lot of that.
Now, in a perfect world, what kind of levers would you switch to help balance it out a little bit more for Connecticut?
I think one is, I don't see a world where we don't expand the amount of natural gas in the state and lower prices. Even we expect that gas or that electricity demand over the coming decades will double because of things like EVs and heat pumps in people's homes. Even if we fill all of that with renewables, which, maybe we should, you're still going to have a gas system that doesn't have enough gas, right? You still have this existing gas system that doesn't have enough gas in order to support the electricity that it produces. So you need more natural gas supply, even in some of the more optimistic scenarios of renewable penetration in the grid. And so I think that's number one. And I think number two is we do need to think about a better way to socialize some of the costs of things like some of our grid issues around the region. So for example, Connecticut bears a lot of the burden around the Millstone power plant. How do we maybe have better regional approach? Because that benefits everybody in the region but by the same token, how do we make sure that we're investing in the transmission infrastructure and make it easier to build that transmission infrastructure so it's cheaper? We've had examples most recently of things in Bridgeport getting blocked, building new transmission lines that could potentially allow all types of energy to flow more readily and more cheaply in the state. So how do we make it easier to permit new projects? How do we make it easier to build those projects and make it cheaper ultimately to have more energy and a more abundant energy supply in the state?
So what you're saying really is it's not that we have to choose between one or the other, nor should we. It really needs to be an all of the above approach.
Absolutely. I think that these resources complement each other. I think that there's a lot of advantages to renewables. There's a lot of economic advantages to renewables that, they make it easier to run our grid. But ultimately, I think we need to have both. We need to be cognizant of both. And I think I worry that if we are shutting one out purely sort of on ideological grounds, we might not necessarily get to the optimal outcome for everybody.
And, the big news just came out of Millstone about the acquisition. What do you see that as an opportunity or a challenge?
I think it's an opportunity. I think that, in terms of new ownership, hopefully, I think institutional inertia is often a challenge in any type of deal. Perhaps there's an opportunity there with new ownership and new folks in the fray to revisit some of the things that we've done in the past and try to make it better for all parties. I think everybody would appreciate a greater degree of certainty, whether you're Millstone or the people of Connecticut or the people of New England. Having a better degree of certainty that we're going to have this generator for a long period of time, I think would be great for everyone.
Now, I know, with the CBIA Foundation, really there's going to be kind of more research done. What are certain areas that you're looking to explore as we continue to look to be part of this conversation and provide some solutions?
Yeah, I think part of it is, I think the state has been working on their integrated resource plan. So, being able to contribute to that, which is essentially what we use to plan our grid going forward. I think as well, thinking about ways that we can help support the electrification of the economy. That's something that's it's coming. People are continuing to do that. But how do we make sure, for example, that we know where the grid capacity is to build new EV chargers, which is something that we don't really have a lot of insight into. And I think that's something the foundation can help with. It's evaluating, the impact of incentives on helping people get access to heat pumps or EVs or things like that, and making sure that we're not overspending the state's resources on things that maybe are not spent in the right place, right? That's the kind of thing that I think I'm most interested in using, helping support on the foundation side, is how do we make sure that people have the best insight possible into all these different types of opportunities and programs so that we make the best decision to, again, both meet our economic goals, but also our, climate and environmental goals that we have.
Yeah, because sometimes they really hit each other.
They do. But again, as I pointed out about the CCEA paper, in the case of natural gas, they worked in tandem. The adoption of natural gas drove down emissions from the power sector by 15%, drove, sulfur dioxide, NOx down by 75, 99%, depending on, I might mix those two up. But, it's helped improve a lot of air quality. It's helped reduce our emissions. They don't always have to go, they don't always have to butt up against each other. They can often work together.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dustin. We appreciate having you on. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about Dustin's response to the report, you can go to our website, CBIA.com. That's a wrap on this week's BizCast. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. In the meantime, give us your feedback and let us know if there are any guests you'd like to hear from by emailing us at bizcast@cbia.com. Remember, you can listen, like, and subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. For a full list of episodes, head to CBIA.com.